Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Using Visuals and Technology to Build and Teach Language to Individuals with Autism Spectrum Disorders. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our speaker, Dr. Howard Shane.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, even though I can't see you. As Lauren said, we're going to be talking about using visuals and technology to try to build language. I work at the Boston Children's Hospital. I'm on the faculty at Harvard Medical School, and for the past 12 years, I've been working with the Monarch School for Children with Autism in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and working with them with a team of people to try to build their curriculum. And I'm here to represent all the institutions I mentioned. The overview, I'm going to be describing the rationale and some methods for combining visual graphics into the building blocks of language. And I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, you'll have an understanding of the importance of visual symbols and also how to begin to do some combinations that lead to generative language. And it's my goal. Hopefully, we'll have a better insight into how to do that and try to avoid, not entirely avoid, but to improve upon just simply learning scripted language. In 2008, Sharon Weisskap and I published a book called Visual Language in Autism. And in that book, we began to describe what we thought was an important way of using visual supports to help individuals with autism to better communicate and to learn language. It was really just a beginning, and in a sense, it was rather, pretentious of us to suggest that we had a visual language in autism. Just last week, we published a new book through Brooks Publishing titled The Enhancing Communication for Individuals with Autism, a Guide to the Visual Immersion System. And that book I did along with colleagues of mine from the Autism Language Program at Children's Hospital. And also, some of this work has also been tested and tried at the Monarch School in Shaker Heights, Ohio. So, as I like to say, it's not mine originally, but as Sir Isaac Newton has said, I stood on giant shoulders. So we've had a lot of support in the creation of some of the concepts that I'll be talking with you about as we move along today. In the preface of that book, I note what I call the prophetic words of case number 1 in the seminal paper that first describes and defines autism by Kanner in 1943. He talks about case number 1 and mentions that he became interested in pictures and very soon knew an inordinate number of the pictures in a set of Compton's encyclopedia. He knew the pictures of the presidents and knew most of the pictures of his ancestors and kinfolks on both sides of the house. He quickly learned the whole alphabet backward as well as forward and to count to 100. Kanner, 1943. And I think that what he was describing is what we see today in so many children with autism, that their interest in and their strength in visual processing is rather dramatic. And with that in mind, I'd like to think that we can take advantage of that ability and use it to help build and establish a better language. First, a little bit of background. I'd like to make a suggestion, and it's what I consider sort of a clinical developmental trajectory. I would suggest that there are a number, or 6, what we specifically consumer groups, who benefit from the use of visual graphic content in order to be better communicators. At the far left of this trajectory, we have individuals who are what I call pre-seen. In other words, they're not quite ready to be able to really appreciate the content of the scene. If I could jump up to consumer group 4, these are individuals who could use a grid, sort of the traditional layout of communication displays, where there's a grid into these targets we place graphic symbols. One of the problems with the grid, beginning with the grid display, that for many people, as a result of starting at this sort of what I call level 4, that individual, their understanding and use of augmentative graphic symbols really becomes one of scripted language. And I would submit and dare to say that many people, most of their communication using augmented communication is a scripted I plus want plus item. I would suggest that, and there's been research by Light and her associates at Penn State, that suggests that younger children tend to do better with a contextual visual scene than they do with a decontextualized grid. So I would propose that for many children, we may be clinically it may be more relevant to that individual to begin with a scene, gradually make a transition to grids, and then hopefully from the grid begin to transition to text and text displays. And quite often, as clinical observations will attest to, and I suspect many of you in the audience throughout the country have seen, that as children become, or as individuals become more proficient with visual graphic information, they tend to become more vocal. Their speech tends to improve. So it's not a surprise, and there is some literature to support that the observation that's made by a number of clinicians. So I would say that clinical observation and some limited research suggests that there is a developmental continuum that extends from what we call noun elements to scene cues to visual scene displays. And eventually you become ready for a grid display made up of the elements of language that I'll be describing as we go through this seminar this morning. A moment, I'm going to talk about the reality of expressive language in moderate to severe autism. I recognize that I have a red light of bias on right now. This is a reality that I think is a reasonable way to think about expressive language in moderate to severe autism. That spoken output is predominantly made up of scripted phrases, that most of the communication is requesting as the predominant communicative function. Social interactions most often require prompting by an adult, a parent, a teacher, and so forth. Instruction is often focused on expression, and text, the picture exchange communication system, is the predominant instructional strategy. With PECS, the individual is taught as they advance in the system to use the scripted phrase I plus want plus the item that they're requesting and please. Now, it is the case that this does become a rather effective way for individuals to be able to make some requests. So I'm not suggesting that the text is not effective. I'm just suggesting I think we can do more. As I'll say as we move along here. Don't ever say I want. This was a student of mine sent me this slide because I would propose that we want to try to get away from sentences that are always just scripted, preceded by I plus want. I have to ask the question, is it a communication glass ceiling if we only adopt the picture exchange communication system? In other words, is it possible that we can go further than some of this scripted requesting and with some scripted commenting? And I suspect that we can. I'm not suggesting that there are many aspects of the text system that are important and useful. I'm just suggesting that we can go further, and I think we should avoid an exclusive focus on scripted language. I'd like to talk a bit, and much of what I'll be talking about today will be talking about comprehension. And let me talk about some of what I perceive, again, with my biases, but my observations, the reality of language comprehension in individuals with moderate to severe autism. First of all, there is a greater noun comprehension, both spoken and visual, that they recognize nouns, that there's a limited understanding of verbs, prepositions, adjectives, question forms. So these are what I would call sort of the elements of language. Nouns are understood, but these other more combinative aspects of language are often problems for them to understand and to use. Spoken language is often understood, but it's done so within routines. So we know that a continuous presentation of similar statements leads to comprehension. And it's also the case that context tends to facilitate understanding. As I've already mentioned, these are individuals who do show strong visual processing skills. In a study that we did and published in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities, there's a very strong interest in electronic media. This is just the front page of that paper. But what that gave us some guidance and gave us further clarification that perhaps the use of visuals to help build language, we have the advantage of using a medium that is extremely attractive to the individual on the autism spectrum, and also a medium that will enable us to be able to build and improve upon their language abilities. I want to talk about the notion of augmented input. Augmented input. And if we were to define it, I would call it the introduction of a visual entity, both graphic or an object, typically in conjunction with speech, that is intended to improve understanding. This is a definition that is evolving with my doctoral student, Anna Allen, and myself, and we're in a paper that we're preparing. Another way to think about augmented input is the synchronized presentation of graphic symbols or object cues while speaking with the intention of improving understanding and expression. Now, there's a number of approaches that have been described in the literature that I think are important for us to at least be aware of. The idea of augmented input is not unique with our program at Boston Children's Hospital or at the Monarch School. But again, we have tried to pay attention to that literature and use it to improve the way in which we can improve understanding using visual supports. The first time the term, at least we can determine, was used was in a paper that described it and called it augmented communication input. And that was suggested as a way to improve comprehension of spoken language. And it was where a communication partner writes or types key elements of the message into some communication system. And that was work done by David Buchelman and his colleagues at Nebraska in 1988. He suggested it, they suggested it, and its use was with adults with aphasia, not autism. Perhaps the most common term that we hear in association with using visual input, or what we're going to focus on augmented input, is the work of Carol Goossens and what she called aided language stimulation, or ALGS. And she talked in terms of using short, simple, slowed rate of speech, expanding on language produced by the learner, emphasizing key words. And as she talked, she suggested that you would point to symbols on a child's communication display in conjunction with ongoing language stimulation. And one study that she did was using it with children with cerebral palsy. This was an example of what was called a topic display that appeared in it's a topic display on the Toca Boca kitchen, and it was on the Spectrum website, and they refer to it as aided language stimulation. In the case of aided language stimulation, I have to ask the question, does pointing to symbols while speaking improve understanding? Now, to go back to this slide, the idea would be that I would point to different graphics while I'm talking. And the hope is that as I'm pointing to the symbols, the listener would be able to have improved comprehension. I don't think that the idea of combining symbols together in this manner has actually been looked at in terms of being able to touch these different graphics and for the listener to understand, because the typing or the touching is going to be happening rather rapidly. And one has to ask, and probably a study that needs to be conducted, whether or not this is actually going to lead to improved comprehension. Now, I think that we can improve it if we were to add what I would call a message or an accumulator window, where as I click, the information would then go into the message window, giving the individual the ability to be able to go back and refer, and that ability to reference may help with understanding. Again, that remains an empirical question, and I think that we need to get greater information to understand, again, the best ways in order to be able to improve understanding using aided language or augmented input. Bromsky and her group talked about a system for augmenting language. And in this case, they used the output from a communication device during naturalistic interventions in order to improve understanding. So it was the speech synthesized output rather than natural speech that they were using. So again, we're using a different approach, but again, we're trying to use speech output from, in this case, a VOCA, voice output communication aid, and they did this with a general AAC population. Cafiero, who's done a lot of work with aided language, did what she called natural aided language stimulation, or NALS. And again, the symbols were highlighted as a message was spoken. She did not use VOCA. She described it as a second language. I like that thinking, and she did use it with individuals on the autism spectrum. So this is the first time that it's actually been specifically focused on autism. Wood and others at Nebraska in '98 talked about an AAC input framework. And again, the idea of augmented input, and in this was a theoretical paper. It wasn't applied to a particular population, but talking about augmenting messages and mapping languages and symbols and augmenting retention, which I think is important. That's the idea of being able to reference so you can go back and it would help with retention. And then Draeger talked about aided language modeling, and she would point to a reference, and they were working on single symbol understanding, and that was applied to an autism spectrum population. And others from the same group talked about aided AAC modeling, and they applied to children with apraxia of speech, childhood apraxia of speech, children with Down syndrome, and Prader-Willi. So again, broad approaches. And others from that same group were also introducing it and trying to use a VOCA, or a voice output communication aid, and they used it with children with cerebral palsy and other developmental disabilities. So as you can see, there's been a number of different ways of using different terms and it applied to different populations. In some work that we did at our center, we were focused on augmented input using what we call visual scenes, which I'll be define further in a moment. All of the previous approaches have used the segments of language, or what I would call language elements. What we introduced was the idea of a scene cue, which we would call a dynamic or static scene cue, and we published this paper in the Journal of Speech and Hearing Research in 2013. We also have a study underway right now where we're analyzing the data at the Monarch School, where we're seeing similar results, that compared to spoken language input, if you add a scene cue as input, it improves comprehension. So there was higher accuracy in the augmented input population, and we only used it in our study at Children's and also at the study at Monarch, using it with individuals on the autism spectrum. So let me say a little bit more about what a scene cue is. It's a short video clip of an action being performed. The learner imitates the video. It grabs their attention. It's easy to replay for repeated instruction. An example of a functional dynamic scene cue simply hang up your coat. And, or you could you ask the person to put something in the trash. Now, as simple as that may seem, by just showing that we can, we're introducing a functional dynamic scene that will enable understanding for many individuals with moderate to severe autism. Here's an example of a young guy at the Monarch School who is introduced to a visual. Watch his attention. He's being asked to push the car, and now we show him a scene cue. Watch the rapt attention when he, there it is. Now he sees it, now he gets it, and then he pushes. So that's an example of a dynamic scene, and you'll be seeing some more. Let me show you a dynamic scene in one of our software programs called Teaching Language Concepts, which I'm going to be showing you more of. In this case, the man is on the cup, and the child looks at it, and he then puts the man on the cup. So again, we're talking about a preposition on. The verb cup, the verb man, quite often, as I suggested, would be understood, but it's the use of the dynamic scene cue that provides the information that allows them to be able to process and act on the preposition itself. Here's an example of several actions within. This has been embedded in the app Autismate. And full disclosure, Children's Hospital has licensed some of our technologies to Autismate. So we work with them in developing some of the materials that are used in that particular, with the special needs wear company. So I want to show you where we have a Play-Doh activity embedded, where we're giving the directive to a child who, if I ask them to cut or roll or squish the Play-Doh, they're not following those action verbs commands, but when we give them the dynamic scene cue, they do. In this case, squish the Play-Doh.
Squish.
And then they squish. In this case, press the Play-Doh.
Press.
And it's rather dramatic, and it's not just occasional. It's rather dramatic how useful these cues are with respect to getting a person to be able to understand what a directive is. Now, we can make these functional. In this case, it's functional with respect to play. And I'm going to be demonstrating how we're also going to use this to build language, but we first need to get some functional cues under control. A static scene cue is a photograph or a still picture that depicts the action being performed on objects or people. And again, the action is implied. It's not implicitly shown when you're using a static scene cue. This is a representation of have Gumby push the car. Here we have the car pushes the ball. Again, everything you need to understand is all contained within that static scene. Now, we can create a number of functional scene cues. For example, in play with toy cars, I can have a static scene of putting the man in the car, driving the car up the ramp. Of course, it can be static or dynamic. Make the car go fast, build the track, add pieces and so forth. We can also use the functional scene cues for daily living activities, bedtime. So I can show a scene cue for putting socks in the hamper, putting on pajamas, toothpaste on the brush, and so forth. So again, I can use these as functional content in order to improve understanding. So the scene cue enables functional practical opportunities, but as you'll see, it also can serve as the foundation for learning symbol syntax. Again, functional communication, but also as the foundation for teaching symbol syntax. So we've talked about dynamic scene cues, the full motion video clips. We've talked about static scene cues. Now we get to what we call language elements. And as I mentioned, many of the studies that have been done have focused on language elements. These are graphic icons that represent the individual linguistic components that make up an action, the subject, objects, verbs, prepositions, and adjectives. Now we're getting to language. It's not just scripted. Here's an example of Alicia blows the bubble. But there's nothing inherently related between blowing and bubble by these isolated graphic symbols, and that's what needs to be taught. There's nothing inherently related between Alicia blowing and the bubble. Again, it's something that has to be taught. So as far as improving comprehension, augmented input with visual scenes, there's much work to be done to really understand how elements alone can be used to improve speech. But if I just presented a series of elements to a child who hasn't been introduced to how they are brought together, I don't think if we studied it, we would find that there would be any better understanding than speech alone. So what we have to do is begin to understand, how do I introduce these elements? And I'm going to show you some techniques that we've been introducing. And then how best do we teach the elements? Because learning the elements of language really brings us to a point where we're teaching generative language, and that's really where I think we should be focused. We like to we're using the term augmented input. Augment has to do with adding something. I understand why Goossens used the word aided, but one of the problems with aided is that if you talk about aided AAC, that tends to refer to using some kind of a communication device as opposed to unaided communication devices where you're using natural gesture or speech or sign. So I think that an augmented input was the first term that Buchelman introduced, and I think it's a good term. Obviously, we are introduced to different terminology. It would be good if we, I think, adopted a single term and people could use a common denominator as we begin to study and more effectively find the most efficacious ways of using augmented input to improve comprehension. So I think there's an empirical question. I mean, one might ask, does synchronized presentation of graphic symbols while speaking, otherwise known as augmented input, lead to improved understanding and expression? I think that based on available research, as limited as it might be, using a number of different populations, calling it something different, having different clinical or research objectives, I think it's fair to say that based on clinical observations and research, and research done by quality people, I think we can ask the question, to what extent does the synchronized presentation of graphic symbols while speaking, augmented input, lead to improved understanding and expression of spoken and or visual language? So I think that we're at a point in our development where we can really begin to understand the extent to which using graphic input, along with speech, augmented speech, can improve understanding and also serve as the basis for improved understanding of generative language. So what do we know about augmented input? The literature offers some evidence that comprehension and expression can be improved through augmented input. Clinical observations suggest that exposure to symbol sequencing during an immersive experience can lead to improved comprehension and expression. This really, what we have observed over the years, that if multiple partners introduce elements of language over time, many individuals can learn to benefit from augmented input. But is there an optimal approach or approaches that can improve how effective we can be in using this to both improve functional understanding, but also to improve expression? And which candidates, which child who has comprehension difficulties and expressive language difficulties is going to optimally benefit from this approach? We have a long way to go, but I think that paying attention to it is going to lead us to much more effective language improved strategies. I'm going to now talk about some strategies that we've been working with at the Autism Language Program at Boston Children's Hospital and also at the Monarch School. So I'm going to talk about outcomes from exposure to what we call mixed displays for improving understanding. I'm going to talk about some pilot work and some clinical outcomes from a software program called Teaching Language Concepts. And I'm also going to be talking about topic displays as a way of improving understanding. So the question becomes, can technology facilitate the acquisition of symbol syntax or the linking of element cues, the sequencing of graphic symbols? I think the answer is yes, and I'll try to explain why. So we're going to look at teaching language concepts, mixed displays, topic displays. Let's take mixed displays first. Here's an example of a mixed display. We'll go back to what I had shown you earlier, and here's the scene cue. It's a static representation. And when we first started to work on this, we just created this in PowerPoint. So I have a static scene. I can show the static scene of and I would have these objects, obviously this figurine and this object in a tabletop activity, and I would ask, can you have Gumby push the car? And once I have success with this scene cue, static scene cue, I can then begin to add or include the elements of language. So in this case, it's Gumby, it's car, and the question then becomes, can I then teach the concept of push? So it's Gumby, push the car. Now, in this case, we have the scene cue, we have Gumby, but we've added an element of animation to the concept of push. And we've done, these are some graphics that we've created at Boston Children's and have licensed again to the Special Needs Wear Autismate group, where we're using, and in some studies we've conducted, action does improve understanding of action. So I want to show you what that action symbol looks like.
Push.
So in this case, push. Action leads to an understanding of action. So in this case, if we have Gumby as the noun element, we'd have the verb here, we have the car as the object of that sentence. Similarly, we have the same kind of static scene cue, but we've also added some referencing. So we try to teach the individual that Gumby relates to Gumby in the static scene, and the car is the car, and again, we get action. Now, that was some work that we did and with just building these in PowerPoint. We've now are building these mixed displays within and integrated in the Autismate app. And let me show you what this looks like. It's about to be released in the Autismate 365 release. And I want to show you a couple of examples first of a dynamic action scene and then a static scene. So here is the static. So it's all on the iPad.
Kermit.
So it's
Push.
Kermit pushes. You notice the push verb and the car. And then it speaks it. So in this case, what we have is Kermit pushes the car. In the next one, one second, we just need to find this video. Putting these ready for WebEx, the videos are a little bit mixed up, so I won't be able to show you the other dynamic scene, but we basically have Gumby pushing the car, and it's a dynamic scene of that, and then it then shows the elements of Gumby plus push plus car. So the mixed display, what I like about the mixed display is that we start with something that we bring some success in the use of the functional scene cues, whether they're static or dynamic that I mentioned. So we immediately provide for the person with moderate to severe autism, we provide a medium to begin to improve their understanding of directives. Actually, we have found, this is what I was showing you. So from the scene, it brings up Gumby. This was a preposition. Gumby's in the truck. So then I go to the elements of Gumby.
Gumby.
In, and you see the animated graphic for the preposition of in. And the truck.
Truck.
So again, what we're trying to do is use a model of a scene that the individual successfully can carry out the direction imposed or that's part of that scene, and then use it as the foundation to then begin to build language. And that's what's really critical here. I'm going to move on now to teaching language concepts. And in this case, with again, the noun elements are not generally the problem. The instructional difficulty is with the verbs, the prepositions, the adjectives. In this case, is an example of just using a noun element. And just basically saying, you know, put the
clean up
car in, clean up.
Good job. Clean up the block.
Put the block, clean up, and so forth.
Good. So here we're using the program teaching language concepts. And we're going to view the sentence first. And in this case,
we're using some animation, some Disney animation, and in addition to media being hugely interesting to individuals, they're especially interested in many of the Disney. And so let me show you.
I'm so sleepy. Now Minnie's falling fast asleep.
Minnie's asleep. Now I can begin to build the sentence and sleep. And I have the animation for sleeping, and it's marqueed. And when I click on it, the reinforcement is it plays the video itself. In this case, we see the video, the scene cue, and we can begin to build the sentence.
Awesome.
And finally, and again, build the sentence and make the choice.
Nice work.
Now, I can also create the sentence first, and we'll do just one more example where I pick Donald, I pick falling, and then I play it, and then I get reinforced. Okay, I think that you get the idea that we're using a video, and then we're building scenes, and you notice that there were greater numbers of items to choose from in that particular example. So with the mixed display has just one opportunity that we're beginning with the teaching language concepts to increase the number of possibilities. And that brings us right to what we call our topic displays. So here's an example of a topic display where we have our subjects, our actions. It's our belief that as the individual becomes more and more facile with some of the elements of language, the way to improve their ability to use language is to use the vocabulary that's relevant to a particular topic. So the topic display really is just that we select the individuals, the action, the prepositions, and so forth that go along with that particular topic. Here's a video of a topic display with some of the characters. You've met Gumby already, and Woody, and Batman, and Kermit, and they're going to be acting on some of the objects that you've seen. So here, we begin with the selection. This is in this particular case, I'm using Proloquo to have Gumby pushes the car. Again, this was built in Proloquo. Woody in the truck.
Woody and truck.
Woody's in the truck. So the idea is that we've captured vocabulary, and again, we wouldn't be introducing this until we've had success with a dynamic or static scene cue. So in a sense, the dynamic scene cue or the static scene cue forms the foundation for moving on to both having more functional language, but also to be able to use it to begin to build syntax, to create more generative language. I'd like to spend a few moments talking about some other language approaches. Recently, there was a book that's just come out by Susskind, who is a writer for the Wall Street Journal. And he talked about his son acquiring language through Disney videos. And I think that there's no question that there's some importance to and relevance to how attractive video is, and certainly the Disney video. In fact, even Walt Disney talked about an animation offers a medium of storytelling and visual entertainment, which can bring pleasure and information to people of all ages everywhere in the world. I think that's absolutely the case. I had a parent say to me once, she'd do it if Winnie the Pooh told her to do it. And that's really the case, that we know that media is really attractive. This was the article in the New York Times, Reaching My Autistic Son Through Disney, that Ron Susskind wrote. It just appeared recently. Now, there's no question that his work raised awareness of Disney animations, and there's no question that animation has a place in language instruction. The outcomes he talked about are based on anecdote, not behavioral science. Again, not that I don't think that animation was important to his son and important to some understanding of language, but I think that we have to take that information and put it in through a filter that says that there was certainly some outcomes, but I'm also concerned about some of the potential for negative consequences, and what I would call an unintended consequence, and that would be for parents to think that if I just keep exposing my child to Disney video, that it's going to lead to language understanding. I'm very skeptical of that kind of information, and I think that as a professional, and as we all as professionals need to do more to use some behavioral science using information that we know is attractive and to the child in order to better or to improve the possibilities of learning language. So I think it's been important, and I'm pleased that this information has come out. But I think we can do better. Just last week, there was a paper that came out, a New York Times article that came out, talking about social pragmatic language acquisition through interaction with Siri. Again, interesting, and I wouldn't suggest that we shouldn't think about it. Her article was titled Siri with Love, How One Boy with Autism Became Best Friends with Apple's Siri. I think the paper had some important points to be made, especially about voice recognition. She makes a comment that she saw that her son, these are some of the interactions. Siri, it's nice to be appreciated. And Gus, her son, said, well, you're always asking if you can help me. Is there anything you want? And so forth. And she captured some of the interactions that were going on. What she also stated that I have seen myself is that when you use voice recognition, it tends to create, you tend to use your voice differently in order to be better understood. And I think an unintended consequence of Siri for anybody using voice recognition is that you learn to improve your articulation in order to be understood. So I think that there's certainly that output, and I think that just exactly the effect of Siri on social pragmatics remains to be studied, but I'm not suggesting that wasn't a reasonable and responsible paper to come out. But I think it requires more thinking. So we've come to the end of this webinar, and I guess now we would just open it up to questions. But let me just say in summation that I think that we can, as a professional group, begin to become more adept at finding ways to use content that's both attractive to individuals on the autism spectrum, and also to take and use some of that information to really build language and to allow for practical functional language. So with that, I'd like to open it up if there are any questions from the audience.
If you have a question, please click on the green bar at the top that says you are sharing Monarch webinar, and you'll click the chat menu, and you will chat your question to the host.
Okay. So thank you. Well, thank you for, wait a minute. I'll get one here. I saw a couple of questions come up. Let me see if I can address them. Okay. Or just the video one. Interesting question. One is, where does video modeling fit into this framework? The idea that there's a growing literature using video modeling to improve a number of skills and activities. So there's certainly a video model is certainly a first cousin to a scene cue. When we apply the term of a scene cue, we're really trying to use it more specifically with respect to language, following specific directions. Video modeling will allow for the learning of various activities, and it's certainly important. And I think it's important to point out that there's a growing, impressive literature on how effective video modeling is, and that kind of effectiveness allows us to be able to perform or to introduce the specific language instruction that I was talking about today. I'm trying to read here. Is there what kind of apps? The question is, what kind of apps are useful for kids with autism for communication? There really are a number of apps that are communication-based, and they range now from both grid-based apps. I mentioned two today. I mentioned Proloquo, and I mentioned Autismate. Autismate is more scene-based, but does allow for some grids. And Proloquo is a very popular, well-tested application that really grew out of a 20-year history of using augmented communication. As far as other apps, if you send an email to me, I can give you some links to some of the sites that will give you a breakdown of different communication applications, but there are many out there, and it's important that to try to find the application that is based on the presenting capabilities of the student. I tried to impress that upon you when I was talking about that clinical trajectory earlier today. One of the questions here has to do with where can I get video modeling. I think that, again, if you were to email me and we can post that on the website, I can send you a bibliography on video modeling. There's a question as to whether a child's motion sensory integration is integrating and interacting with language expression and understanding. I guess we could have another seminar on that, but I think it's fair to say that when children are, when their sensory issues are in better shape, they're going to be more capable of paying attention and responding to the content that's contained on the video. The email, it's one person asked if I could, my email, it will be posted on the Monarch site, but it's howard.shane@children's.harvard.edu. I think that's it for the questions. And I want to thank you all for listening and for the questions. And again, if there are any other questions, feel free to email me and I'll do the best I can to respond to those. So thank you very much.
And as a reminder, we will be posting a video recording of this webinar along with the presentation and Dr. Shane's email address on our website in the next few days. And we will be sure to send you a link to all of those pieces. Thanks again so much for participating.